And as we come together, I just want to have us come in the tone of the welcoming prayer of Father Thomas Keatings, in his words that I welcome everything that comes to me in this moment because I know it is for my healing. I welcome all thoughts, feelings, emotions, persons, situations, and conditions. I open to the love and presence of God in the healing action and grace within. I am so grateful that all of you are here today, that we are discussing the topic of immigration and of our brothers and sisters that have come to this country. And we are so fortunate to have an expert in our presence, and someone that can share his expertise with us to help us create more empathy and understanding for those that we are walking beside, those that are coming in, our clients, our personnel, or who we are walking with, or who we are going to visit and see. And so at this time, I want to introduce, we have Jorge Barón, who brings today with us his passion for this issue, himself being an immigrant to this country when he was 13 from Bogota, Colombia. And then he went on to Duke University. And from there, he followed his passion to Yale Law School and gained the expertise to immediately put his experience and expertise into action at the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. And from there, he served as the legal counsel for years. And for the last over 13 years, he's been serving as their executive director. So he has a breadth and depth of experience and expertise to share with us. So I want to remind you that please, as questions come up, enter them into the chat. This is being recorded, and and his PowerPoint that he's going to be using, all will be available to you in a follow-up email. So if you have any questions, please access your chat and add it, and we'll address those questions, and also be considering other topics that we can address around this issue. So Jorge, thank you. We've heard nothing but praise about your good work, and we're so grateful that you're taking the time to share your knowledge and expertise and broadening our knowledge and wisdom about this issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you today, and I am just grateful to have the opportunity to share some of the information about our work and about the immigration system. And this is a very complex topic, and so I really appreciate that all of you are taking the time to learn more, because I think one of the things that I find about the immigration debate and immigration policy frequently is that folks feel a little bit uncertain about it because it is so complex. And so I always appreciate when people are investing the time to learn more and to understand that, in fact, it is very complex and difficult. And so I honor all of you for doing that, and I appreciate that many of you are already working with the same communities that we are working with, and I appreciate your ministry in that regard. So as Karen mentioned, I'm going to be using a PowerPoint, and so the downside of the PowerPoint sometimes is that you don't get to see my face as big, but I think it will help us guide this discussion. And I do want to make sure that we leave a significant amount of time for questions. So please, as you get questions, feel free to type them in, and Karen, feel free to interrupt if there's something that wasn't clear that I don't catch on the chat, since I might not be able to see it. But we'll definitely have like a significant amount of time at the end to do that Q&A. So let me switch over to my PowerPoint here, and if you'll all just give me 1 second while I do that switch, we will. I'm going to share with you the PowerPoint. I hope that's visible to everybody. I wanted to first, before we get started, just to give you a little bit of understanding of who I am and our organization and the background that I bring to this conversation. So my organization, the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, was founded in 1984. And we are an organization providing immigration legal services to people here in Washington State, where we're focused. Most of our work is on providing direct legal services to community members, including in the immigration detention system that we'll talk about. But we also are focused on advocacy and community education, which is, things like today, to help people understand the experiences that our clients are facing. We have 4 offices here in Washington State, and again, most of our services is on helping individuals navigate the immigration system, and that's the perspective that I bring. And as Karen mentioned, I myself am an immigrant from Colombia, but I always sort of feel that it's important to note that in many ways, for many of us who have been immigrants, we've had a more privileged path to be able to come to the United States, and my family was able to come on a student visa. My mom eventually remarried a U.S. citizen and ended up, and that's how we ended up being able to stay. But not everybody has the same opportunities to be able to have, pursue that kind of pathway to citizenship that I did. And so I'm very conscious of that when I'm working with a lot of clients who didn't have the same opportunities that I did to be able to come and have that kind of legal pathway. So I wanted to start off, what I wanted to do today is just give an overview specifically about immigration detention, our immigration detention system. But before I launch into that, I wanted to just take a quick moment, because one of the things that you'll find with immigration attorneys is that we tend to start using acronyms and start naming agencies. And so I think it's really helpful just before we start to when I start talking about some of these agencies and who's responsible for what, I always just like to share this screen to share about how our immigration system, there's various different parts of the federal government that are involved. So you have on the left, the Department of Homeland Security. That's kind of the main now immigration agency that controls components like USCIS that handles affirmative asylum applications, ICE, which is probably the one you hear more frequently about, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that sort of runs the detention and deportation system, as well as CBP, which is Customs and Border Protection, that includes the Border Patrol at the border. And then there's other agencies that are getting involved in the process. The Department of Justice is involved in the immigration court system. And also we have the Department of Health and Human Services that runs an agency called the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is involved in handling unaccompanied minors when they arrive. And I'll talk about that briefly too, because oftentimes that issue, well, I think it's different from the adult immigration detention system. Oftentimes you'll hear about it in the news, and I wanted to explain how that's a little bit different. So when we talk about the immigration detention system, what is it? What are we talking about? So I want to emphasize that the immigration detention system is technically a separate system from what we might call kind of the criminal justice system, where you have, first prisons and jails throughout the country for people who are going through the criminal justice system. Immigration detention is a network of approximately around 140 detention centers and sometimes jails that are contracted that are used for civil immigration cases. And so this is for people who are, technically they're supposed to be going through some type of immigration proceeding that is civil in nature. So it's not considered a criminal justice system matter. They're not being in detention is technically under law not a punishment. It is simply like an administrative process for people who are where there's being some process to determine whether they can stay in the United States or not. Now, the detention centers can come in different types. So there are currently a number of, and probably the largest places are privately run detention centers. So these are privately owned by usually corporations, things like Core Civic or the Geo Group, which are private corporations that run these detention centers under a contract with ICE. And so they will enter into an agreement with ICE, and they will run the detention center for ICE. And so ICE officials usually are there, but the people who are actually running the detention center, the guards, are all employees of the detention center. ICE also uses a lot of local government and county jails and sometimes mostly jails that are run by local governments. Sometimes they're being used both for criminal matters, and then there's some part of the jail that is used to detain people, and that's under a contract with ICE. And then less frequently, ICE is running their own detention centers. There's only about, I believe, 6 or 7 now that are directly run by ICE. So that's becoming kind of the less frequent situation. One thing that I want to make sure people know is that this system has grown dramatically over the last couple of decades, and I share the numbers there. So we have gone from a situation where back in the mid 1990s, and this is the number of people, not the number of people who are detained over a year, but the number of people who are detained at any one moment, right? So if you looked at a average day in 1994, you would find that about 7,000 people were detained in immigration detention at any one time in the United States on that date. Cut to 2001, and that number had increased to 19,000. By 2 years ago, before the pandemic, during the Trump administration, we were up to over 50,000 people being detained at any one time. So the numbers have increased very significantly. Now, interestingly, since then, we've seen a big drop, and then an increase again in the last year or so. And the reason for that had to do with kind of two things. One, even before the pandemic, some of the Trump administration policies have blocked asylum seekers from being able to even enter the United States to seek asylum. And so that number had reduced the number of people. And then, of course, the pandemic led to additional restrictions and even limitations on interior enforcement that led the numbers in detention to drop even more. So that by the time that the Biden administration came into office, the number of people who were being detained was 15,000, which is, as you can see, it was, the lowest it had been in about 20 years. Since then, since the Biden administration came into office, the numbers have increased again. And this is partly because the Biden administration has slightly taken away some of the limitations that the Biden administration had placed on the asylum system. And so more people have entered the country, but they've been placed in immigration detention. And that has led to an increase in the number of people in immigration detention back from when it was in January. So you could see that the latest report that we have was that we have slightly over 25,000 people detained at one point. And so I want to emphasize that the number of people who actually pass through the immigration detention system is much higher than that, right? That is just a number that you can, if you did a kind of a census count of everybody who's in detention right now, how many would there be? It would be about 25,000. But if you look at how many people are going to be detained at some point during 2021, you'd be looking at, likely well over 100,000, probably close to, at certain points, it's been around 400,000. So many more people than that are going to spend some time in immigration detention. So one of the examples of what it looks like is, an example of the place that I work at locally in terms of providing services is the Northwest Detention Center. It's now also officially known as the Northwest ICE Processing Center. So this is an example of these private detention centers. So the detention center is owned by the GEO Group, the land, the buildings, the guards are operated by the GEO Group as a corporation, and ICE has a contract with them. And that's an example of our private immigration detention center system. So who ends up being detained in these immigration detention centers? So primarily, there's going to be kind of two big groups of people who are detained in immigration detention at any one time. And I'm going to talk about how the processing for those two groups can be a little bit different. And so I'm gonna focus on them, and I'm going to talk about them as people who are interior enforcement and arrivals at the border. So the folks who are detained within the U.S., they are folks who have primarily been detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, although we also see Border Patrol detaining people who are kind of longtime residents here in the border areas. So who can end up being detained by immigration? Most people will be people who are undocumented. So by undocumented, I mean people who are living in the United States, but who don't currently have permission to be present in the United States. And that could occur for two reasons. One is because they crossed the border at some point earlier, it could be decades ago, and they've been living here in the United States without permission. Or it could also be because they enter the country with a temporary visa initially. It could have been a tourist visa, it could have been a student visa, and they've now overstayed the terms of their being able to be here. And so at some point, ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, identifies that individual, and they realize that the person doesn't have permission to be here, and so they place them in immigration detention for a deportation hearing, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But I think it's also important to note that even people who are lawful permanent residents, so people who are green card holders, so folks who are not yet U.S. citizens, but who do have permission to be here, who do have authorization to live in the United States, and as the word permanent resident suggests, who presumably would be indefinitely able to stay in the United States, could also be placed in deportation, and that is as a result generally because of a criminal conviction. And it doesn't have to be a particularly serious conviction. So we have seen people who had, relatively minor drug offenses. I had a client who had been a lawful permanent resident for 30 years from the Philippines, had lived here for 30 years, and who was arrested for attempted possession of drugs because they found drugs in her husband's car, and that was the basis on which she was placed on deportation proceedings. So very, things that for a lot of U.S. citizens would be considered minor offenses can lead somebody to potentially lose their green card status and be placed in deportation proceedings. Now, one thing that I will note is that President Biden, one of the first things that he did when he came to office was to issue some directives to have ICE officials use more prosecutorial discretion, which means that, even if the ICE encounters somebody who's undocumented, who doesn't have permission to be here, they're supposed to use discretion and not arrest everybody. So under the Trump administration, everybody who is identified should be put in detention and should be put in deportation proceedings. What President Biden has said is let's use discretion and not put everybody in detention. So that should reduce the numbers of people in this category who end up in detention, but it's been hard to judge how much that's having an impact because even under the end of the Trump administration, because of the pandemic, ICE had already had to reduce their enforcement activities just due to the pandemic, and so it's been hard to know how much the Biden policies will change. Although we do think that they will make a difference, certainly from the Trump presidency. So what happens when people get detained in this context, when they're detained in the interior of the United States? So they get brought into immigration detention. Now, some people in these groups may be eligible to ask an immigration judge for release on bond. So this is kind of the equivalent of bail in a criminal case, right? You're asking the judge, please let me out of detention so that I can continue my case, but I don't have to continue the deportation case inside detention. Not everybody's going to be able to ask for bond. So there are some categories of people that immigration says are ineligible for a bond hearing. And so those folks will have to continue their hearings in detention. And then if they don't get bond, or they can't get bond, or can't pay the bond, then they will have, many people, not everybody, will have a full deportation hearing, meaning that they will have a hearing before the judge. And I'm going to talk a little about that in a minute. Now, the reason I say that not everybody gets a hearing is because there are some people who have been previously deported from the United States. So, for example, somebody, and this is not uncommon these days, somebody was deported and then they re-entered the United States. They came back. Somebody was undocumented, immigration found them, deported them, and then they managed to get across the border again. And oftentimes they do that because they're reunifying with family members here that they left behind. And immigration detains them again. At that point, immigration doesn't have to put them through a full deportation hearing again. They can do something called reinstatement of deportation, or reinstatement of removal, which is the word that immigration now uses for the deportation process. And so they can be sent back to their country of origin without an additional hearing, without going before a judge. And so you'll hear of those situations where people have been put through the system and not had a full hearing before an immigration judge. So we talked about the people who are detained at the interior. Probably what's getting even more news these days are people arriving at the southern border. And I say primarily at the southern border because we do have situations where people arrive at the northern border, and particularly for us here in Washington, we do have situations where people are coming over from Canada. But certainly the vast majority of people who arrive are at the southern border. And there we have a very interesting situation and something that's been quickly switching over the last several years. So when people arrive, and I'm going to make a distinction between single adults and families with children and then unaccompanied children, because the process is slightly different depending on who you are when you arrive at the border. So if you arrive as a single adult or a family with children and you have no visa, right, or you don't have any permission to come to the United States, and you don't express when immigration agents and the Border Patrol ask you if you're afraid of returning to your home country, which is what they're supposed to do before they would move to deport you. If you answer that question and you say, no, I don't have a fear of returning, then you're just going to be deported. There's not much processing beyond that. They will just send you back, and that's how it has been for many years, and that's the process right now. So now things have changed a little bit. So I'm going to explain a little bit like what would happen normally in terms of prior to the pandemic and prior to some of the changes that President Trump put into place. So prior to 2019, if you were a single adult or a family with children and you expressed fear to the Border Patrol, then they were supposed to put you through a process that I'll explain in a minute called credible fear interviews, and they would be generally detained during that time, but at least allowed the opportunity to engage into the asylum process. What's happened since then is that President Trump, after the pandemic, instituted some changes. Even prior to the pandemic, he instituted some changes, but I'm not going to get into those here. What he put in place during the pandemic was something called the Title 42 restriction. And Title 42 refers to the portion of U.S. law that covers this because it's about public health, presumably about public health. They basically said, we're not even going to let people apply for asylum. So if you show up, even if you do express fear of return, we're still going to deport you. We're going to still, technically it's known as an expulsion. It's not even a deportation, it's an expulsion. And that had meant that people were not, even if they said, I'm afraid for my life, they would still be sent back. And right now, still most single adults are being processed under Title 42. So they're not being allowed to pursue asylum. Some people are being allowed in, and mostly has to do with who Mexico will accept in terms of being expelled. Most of the families with children right now are able to get in, and again, most of that is because the Mexican government has refused to accept people being expelled. And so it's a little bit of a mix. Some people are getting through the system, but still, most people are being expelled and not allowed to pursue asylum. So that's the situation for single adults and families with children. For unaccompanied children, so we have situations where people arrive with as children under 18, and they don't have a parent or legal guardian with them. And now that group does not have the same situation, and at least under President Biden, Title 42 has not applied to them. So when Border Patrol identifies somebody who's an unaccompanied child, they're supposed to not detain them for any longer than 72 hours, and then they're supposed to be transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement that I mentioned earlier. So they run the system of shelters that are run by nonprofit agencies. The challenge over the last few years has been that those shelters have been completely at capacity, and so they've had to create influx facilities to be able to put those children. And there's been a lot of, particularly in the advocacy community, there's been a lot of concern about the situation for those children. But I do want to emphasize that this is a different process than ICE detention, right? So ICE detention is only for adults and also for families with children. So but not for unaccompanied children. The ORR system is where unaccompanied children end up. And the vast majority of those children ultimately are going to be placed with parent or family that they have already in the US. So that's supposed to be kind of a transitional period for them to be placed. And I know most of you are probably not going to be working in that situation, but I wanted to explain the unaccompanied children because it's something that we often get questions about what happens and why are children in detention. And I think the reality is that, of course, when you're dealing with young children, they can't just be let out on the street, right? Somebody needs to be looking after them, and that's what the system is supposed to do. But let's get back to the idea, and I'm going to go back to talking about a little bit about the single adults, because I think that's the people who all of you might end up being most connected with. So let's go back to the people who arrived at the southern border, and let's say the folks who did not get targeted by Title 42, who were able to go through the asylum process. What does that look like? Well, if somebody shows up and says, "I'm afraid to return to my home country," and again, if they're lucky and they're not going to be sent back immediately by under Title 42, then the Border Patrol, which is again part of CBP, will transfer that person generally to ICE detention. Now, ICE then, and these are the people who end up detained, throughout the country. Initially, they're going to be detained at the southern border, but they frequently are transferred in different parts of the country. So I can tell you right now, for example, in our detention center in Tacoma, even though we're very far from the southern border, we have gotten hundreds of people coming from the southern border that get transferred here to go through this process here. So the next step in the process is, even if the person has expressed fear, that's not sufficient. So there's going to be kind of what I call a screening interview. It's called the credible fear interview. And that is conducted by the USCIS asylum officer, often by phone, who's just trying to determine, does this person have enough of a fear? Is this does this possibly qualify for asylum? It's not a resolution of their asylum case. It's just kind of the screening interview. If the officer finds that the person does have sufficient fear, then that just means that they get sent to immigration court to have a full asylum here, right? It doesn't mean that they get granted asylum. It's just that you pass the first screening stage. If the CFI is negative, as they refer to it, right, it means we don't think you have even a possible case, then there's an opportunity for the person to have that quickly be reviewed by an immigration judge, but it's not a full hearing. It's just a very quick review, and most people are just going to end up being deported, right? So they're just not going to continue in the process. So the folks who do get an immigration court hearing will be able to go before an immigration judge and will be able to present evidence. I'll talk a little bit about the challenges of that. And some people who pass the credible fear interview will then be able to ask the either the judge or ICE for release from detention. So some folks, after that step, after the asylum officer has found them to be credible, then they will be able to seek release from detention. Now, when they go before the immigration judge to apply for asylum, I wanted to just very quickly touch on asylum, because a lot of people think, okay, well, this is one of the main mechanisms that people who are coming from the southern border might apply. It's a difficult process. It's a challenging process because I think most people think that if you're in danger in your home country, that's going to be enough to qualify you for asylum. And certainly, I think that that's what it should be. That's what the rule should be, that if you're in danger, we shouldn't send you back. Unfortunately, and so I put there kind of like one of three of the kind of key things in the asylum process that you have to demonstrate is a well-founded fear of persecution, right? So that's the first part. You have a well-founded fear that you're going to be persecuted in your home country. And a lot of people can make a strong case that they're going to be harmed in their home country that we deal with. The challenge is that asylum not only requires that you're going to be in danger, but it requires the reason you're going to be in danger is one of these 5 protected grounds: your race, your religion, your nationality, your political opinion, or your membership in a particular social group. And that's the part that makes it difficult for a lot of people to seek asylum. Because if you come to the United States and the issue is, some guy in your town hates you and has threatened you and has, tried to kill you even. And it's very clear that that guy will probably kill you when you get, back, if you get sent back. Well, you're certainly in danger. You might say you have a very well-founded fear of persecution, but it's not on account of any of the protected grounds. And so that person very well may not qualify for asylum, right? Not knowing more about their case, that's probably not going to be sufficient, right? And to a lot of people, including to asylum seekers themselves, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like, if I'm going to get killed, who cares why I'm going to get killed? I should be able to get protection, but that's not sufficient, right? And so a lot of folks are not able to get protection because they can't make a case about being on account of a protected ground. Now, one of the challenges is that and finally, so I'll also mention that in addition, you also have to show that you can't obtain protection in your home country, right? And so that's another part that sometimes people are not able to demonstrate. Anyway, we can tackle that if there's questions about the asylum process, because it's a complicated subject, and I could talk for hours about asylum, but we won't have time for that. So this is what happens. You end up in this setting, and this is a picture that we have of the immigration court in the detention center in Tacoma. This is what it looks like, and most immigration courts look similar to that. So you'll see, there'll be an immigration judge who works for the Department of Justice, who will be up at the front desk. And then you'll have, a prosecutor from ICE who will be in one of the desks there on the left. And then you have the person who's going to be, facing deportation and potentially asking for asylum on the middle table. The thing that's different about this courtroom is that there is no right to appointed counsel. So if the person who's facing deportation can afford to hire an attorney, they can bring the attorney and they can have the attorney help them. But most people do not have those resources and cannot, and there is no right to appointed attorney. So unlike in the criminal justice system, where you will get a public defender if you can't afford an attorney, there is no such right currently in the immigration court system. And so you have folks who are in the asylum process or in the deportation process who are going to have to fend for themselves and try to make a case on their own. And as you can imagine, the challenges of somebody, particularly people who are English is not their first language, who have all kinds of other barriers to be able to make a case through this very complicated process. So this is one of the biggest issues that we see for folks, is having to navigate the system without legal representation. And so that's, we're turning now to the challenges for people in immigration detention, and that is probably the first one that I would highlight, and obviously, very close to our heart, because this is the gap that we try to close, which is there is no right to appointed representation. So again, only if you can afford an attorney do you have the right to bring somebody in court, or if you can get help from one of the nonprofits, including organizations like ours, to be able to come in and help you with your case. And I will say that, it's bad enough when it comes to adults that they don't get a representation, but even children can be placed in deportation proceedings. So I mentioned unaccompanied children, right, that go through the system in the Office of Refugee Resettlement. They're still in deportation proceedings, right? So the fact that they were ultimately potentially placed with families still means that they're in deportation proceedings and still could be deported. And they're also required to go to court. And they also don't have a right to appointed attorneys. So you actually have children going before an immigration judge and supposed to, as I put in quotation marks, represent themselves, which is, ludicrous, really. Ultimately, you can't have a child represent themselves. And I don't think an adult really, who's not a lawyer, can't really efficiently or effectively represent themselves. But that's the system that we have right now. And that's one of the biggest problems that I see in the immigration system. So that's a huge challenge that people in immigration detention face, is the fact that they're going through this process without legal assistance, and that makes it very, very difficult for them to be able to obtain protection. The numbers depends on the study you look, but between 5 and 10 times less likely to be able to obtain protection if you don't have a lawyer. And so that's a significant barrier for people to be able to actually make a legitimate case, to be able to show a case. They might have a legitimate case, but they're just not able to actually present it to immigration court in order to get that protection. So that's a huge challenge. The other challenge is inhumane detention conditions. And, of course, I'm an advocate, and I understand that some people might say, well, look, like you have a kind of a not objective perspective on this. Because you're, on the side of immigrants. And so I'm sharing with you language from the Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General. So this is language that they did when they did a review back in 2019 of the conditions in immigration detention centers. They did these unscheduled reviews and visits because Congress had actually directed them to do this. And this is the language that you'll see there, where they said, our observations confirmed concerns identified in detainee grievances, which indicated unsafe and unhealthy conditions to varying degrees at all of the detention centers they visited. And so again, this is like language from, not an advocate. This is from the Homeland Security's Inspector General, and I'm pointing there to a resource, our colleagues at Detention Watch Network, which do a lot of work in reporting on this. There's lots of reports about the conditions, and we could tackle in the Q&A if you want to discuss like the reasons that I think there are conditions problems. But ultimately, from our perspective, I just don't believe those people should be detained in the first place. So our efforts are not ultimately really about improving conditions. It's about getting people out of detention. But certainly, if there are going to be any people detained, the conditions should be much better than they are currently. The other challenge that I see for people in immigration detention is that they're enduring multiple levels of trauma. So obviously, we talked about asylum seekers. So asylum seekers will bring the trauma of the reasons that they had to flee their countries, right? Which could be, things that are incredibly difficult, harrowing, and difficult for many of us to understand. They may also be dealing with trauma of the trip to the United States, which for many people is incredibly arduous and dangerous. And for example, women involve things like sexual assault and very serious risk of harm. There's the separation from family. So obviously people who left their home countries may have left, family members behind, but also we see people who are detained in the United States who, were living in their homes, had been, built a family here, and all of a sudden are put into immigration detention, and are now facing, not only have they just been separated, but now they're facing the fact that they might be potentially deported permanently. And then the trauma of just being in detention is also something that we see that causes tremendous challenges to people. There's the language and cultural barriers. The inability to contact family or loved ones because of being in immigration detention. Oftentimes people have to pay for calls and are not able to afford to do that. The other challenge that I see is that, people, there's no clarity about what's going to happen and no clear timeline. So, if you are, convicted of a criminal offense, for example, you will be told, this is when you're going to be released, right? And so you kind of know when your time will be up. But if you're in immigration detention, you're an asylum seeker and you're fighting your case, we have had people who've ended up in detention for years, right? And you don't know, you can be going through appeals. There's no clarity how long that's going to take. There may be some rough sketches, but you don't know when it's going to be. And so a lot of people, that uncertainty is really traumatizing for folks. And then, of course, there's vulnerability for particular groups who are in the immigration detention. We particularly see it with people with mental health concerns, people in the LGBTQ community, lots of folks who are feeling particularly vulnerable being in an immigration detention center and have difficulties understanding, particularly people with mental health issues, understanding even where they are or what's happening in their case. So what are ways that people can help people who are in immigration detention? One of the main ways that we see is just being able to connect people to resources that might be available, although I do want to note that these are unfortunately limited. Whether to connect them to a legal representation agency or to some organizations that are providing services that vary across the United States. Providing some hope for people, and I know, but not false hope, because I think that can be also dangerous, right? I think one of the challenges of being in immigration detention is that oftentimes you're dealing with a system that's pretty unfair. And I think, frankly, even acknowledging that is important. When I deal with people in immigration detention, a lot of folks will say, why are you putting me in detention, right? You have this image. I remember working with an asylum seeker who told me, you in the United States say that, you have the Statue of Liberty. You say, you want people who are fleeing persecution to come here. And that's what I've done, right? I've come here to seek help. And now you're putting me in jail. Like I did something wrong. Why did you do that? And I think part of that is empathizing with them that, yes, there is unfairness in the way that they're being treated. And I think that's important, acknowledging that feeling. And particularly because, you might be the only person who they have contact with that's not kind of in the system that is impersonating them, right? So most of the people who are in immigration detention, the main people they're going to have contact with are going to be the guards and the ICE officials, right? Who are kind of trying to deport them or trying to keep them in detention. And so I think it's important to have somebody who they see to be on their side. If it's possible to make sure that they're connected to family. Again, sometimes people aren't even able to make phone calls to let them know where they are. We get calls from people all the time who say, my cousin was detained and I have no idea where they are, right? And they can't track them down. And then, understanding and appreciating and being there for their trauma, understanding that, we're not counselors, but oftentimes just the fact that there's somebody who can listen to them about their experiences, I think is important. And then serving as a witness and if possible, I realize there may be limitations on this, but that folks who can advocate for changes when you see some of the problems that we see in the immigration detention system. So, Karen, I know we're running quick, but I'll just share a quick story because I want to illustrate and I want to make sure again that we tackle questions that people have. But I just wanted to share a story about how this plays out because I just shared a lot of information and about details. But I want to, close by sort of reminding us all that this is about people, right, who are going through the system. And I know all of you know this well, but just it's important to remember. And so I've had, I started my career at Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, working with people in immigration detention as an executive director. I don't do that in cases these days, but in the last couple of years, we had the situation with the family separation crisis back in 2018 and 2019. And so I was taking some cases. And I ended up working with a client whose name I'll call her Maria. She's said that we could talk about her case, but not use her actual name. So she came to the United States from El Salvador with her daughter to come to the United States to seek protection. And she went through this process that I mentioned. The thing that happened at the time was that when they showed up at the border, the Border Patrol separated her from her daughter. So her daughter was actually put into the ORR system that I mentioned earlier and sent to a shelter, while Maria was ended up initially being held at this federal detention center in SeaTac, which is a federal prison, and ultimately transferred to the Northwest Detention Center. So I met with Maria and had to explain to her the process that I just explained about the fact that she was going to have this credible fear interview. And, of course, like Maria didn't know me, didn't know anything about our organization. We just showed up at the detention center one day, and it took a while for her to, understand that we were there to help and to trust me with her story. And we were about to have that first stage, a credible fear interview. And I've been trying to understand and help her build her asylum, to just help understand the asylum claim and help prepare her for this interview that she was going to have. She had talked about the fact that she had been fleeing, and I told you a story about how she had been fleeing, about people who flee somebody in her town who had targeted her. It wasn't super clear about her asylum claim, but ultimately it became clear that what had happened was actually that this man had targeted her entire family and had actually killed her sister. Because he had been in a relationship with her. And so he basically started targeting the entire family. And that was part of the reason. And that made her claim a lot stronger. And right before the interview, she actually finally disclosed to me that not only had this man targeted her, but also had sexually assaulted her and right before she left. And that was the reason that ultimately compelled her to leave. It took me like weeks to be able to get her to be able to share those details. Like you can imagine how painful that is. And she had told me she had only shared it with one other person before, besides me. And she was going to have to share all those details over the phone with some stranger, right, the next day. And so we had to kind of prepare her for that because it was obviously something that normally she wouldn't have been willing to do. She was ultimately, that she was approved for the credible fear. That still meant that she was going to be in detention. So then we had to present a bond hearing to be able to get the immigration judge to be able to release her. And it was a close call. The judge almost didn't grant release at all because he was doubtful that she was going to be able to win asylum. He was not very supportive of her claim, but ultimately granted her a $15,000 bond, which, for her, it would have been impossible to pay. But we had a community of support here who decided to help fundraise for these kind of cases. And she was ultimately released from detention and able to be reunified with her daughter. who had ended up spending about 2 months in one of the RR shelters before her mom was released. So I just share that story, to say that, there are folks who have endured, very significant trauma, who are going through the system, and who, as fellow human beings, deserve our full support and empathy. I hope that we don't have to deal with the system for very long, but unfortunately, I think we're probably going to still have to deal with that. And so I'm deeply appreciative that many of you are living your faith through working with individuals in the system and helping them navigate a very, very difficult and complicated process. So thank you for that. And let's see, we got 15 minutes, Karen. I think we got some time for questions. So let me open it up, because otherwise I can continue talking for a long time, but I'd love to hear your questions.
We want you to continue. We do have questions, and thank you for that PowerPoint. I live in Texas, and I've been in the border, and in knowing the situation, that was so helpful as far as to lay it out that way. But on that note, as far as the questions, just to back up, when we were just talking about Maria and her daughter, there was a question initially about what happens to the children before they get to these detention centers. And as far as, and I thought that this was presently, they were trying to keep the families, you can't separate them. Is that changed, or was that a past situation, or what happens with the kids?
Yeah, no, that's good, Karen. So yeah, so the story that I was sharing with you was happened in 2018 and 2019. And so you're right that the separation of families, of this type of family, has stopped. But I do want to flag that we still see situations where, for example, let's say an aunt is coming with her niece, right? And so they may be traveling together, and this happens frequently. The mom of this niece may be living in the United States, for example, left the niece behind, traveled years ago to the US, came on her own, left the daughter with her sister, for example, right? And so then the sister and the niece travel to the United States. They have to come. And I say this because we had exactly a situation. They show up at the border, and even today, in that situation, the government will say, well, you're not the parent. And so they might separate that, what I consider a family. They may not be, direct family in the sense that it's not the parent, but you still see situations where children are separated from family members in that context, even today. And so that's something that people have been advocating to try to stop. I think there is movement to do that, and can happen. And of course, there's family separation that happens in immigration detention in other ways, right? So if people get detained, in the interior, they're separated from their children often by the fact that they're deported, right? And so I do want to flag that family separation, happens in the immigration context in many different ways.
And looking at, there's a lot of statistic questions that have popped up, but I appreciate it if you would address basically the ethnicity of the detainees that are coming in. And I know just from my experience on the border here, maybe the 350 people a day that were in the respite center I was in, there was no one from Mexico. It was all Nicaragua, Ecuadorians. It was Central America, and I never ever had any contact with anybody from Mexico. So, we have a wrong concept here. So I was just wondering if you could do you have any statistics in terms of who we're detaining? Because you have in the Northwest, probably more European or African or.
Yeah, well, it varies. So though we do get a lot of people from the border brought up here. So from the southern border brought up here. So if you look at things nationally, I will say that the numbers have kind of like shifted over time, right? So back in like I'd say from 2015 through 2019, we certainly had a large number of people from Central America, and specifically from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras being the vast majority of the people who are being detained, certainly at the southern border, the arriving asylum seekers. More recently, we've seen an increase in the number of people from other countries, and Mexico also some, but you're right that not a majority. And most people think that most people are coming, that just shifted over time. But we do see a lot of people, and this is the part that might be surprising to people, is that we see people from Ecuador, from Brazil, from Haiti, from places like Cameroon and other places in Africa, for example, who have no other pathway, and they've actually made like some like amazing journeys to get to the southern border. Sometimes traveling through South America, through Central America to make it all the way to the U.S. border because that's the only way that they can seek protection. So I can send you some resources on the percentages. I don't have them off the top of my head, and they've changed. So it depends on the snapshot of when you look, but things do change. I will say that we see, for example, I also think that sometimes like when you think of like ethnicities, I do want to flag that, for example, there's a lot of people from Guatemala that are fleeing that are from indigenous communities in Guatemala because a lot of people think like, oh, well, they're Spanish speakers. And actually, they're not. The Spanish may not be any language, or if it is, it's a rough second or third language that they use. And so it's also something to keep in mind, because I think that makes that population particularly vulnerable in some ways, because people think like, oh, if they're from Guatemala, you provide information in Spanish is enough, and that's not the case.
Thank you. In trying to get, I think people are trying to grasp the magnitude of this issue, those that are not working directly with this population. So what percentage of the populations are asylum seekers? And of the asylum seekers make it through the initial interview and then are released to a court date, and then the percentage that return for a court date? Can you give just an overview of that?
Yeah, so I think I first want to sort of clarify that, when we're talking about undocumented community members, I first want to say, when I think of undocumented community members, I think of the people who are already in the United States, living in the United States, right? And so there's estimates are that it's roughly 11 million people who are in that situation. The vast majority of them, I think something like 62% or something like that, have been living in the United States for 5 years or more, right? So that group, I will say, they've been here for a long time. They may have other pathways or claims to be able to stay in the United States. When we talk about the folks who are arriving, I don't necessarily even think of them as undocumented community members, because they're not violating any law. They are just asking for protection. They're showing up at the border and saying like, look, I'm here to seek asylum. Our law says they are entitled to do that. It's very explicit. It says no matter how you arrive, if you're afraid, you can ask for asylum. And so I don't consider them undocumented, because they're not in violation of law. In fact, they're complying with the law by seeking protection. And so if you look at that group, again, the people who are being detained are who get through that initial stage have to be asylum seekers, right? Because if you're not an asylum seeker and show up at the border, you don't have a visa, you're going to get deported. So I would say 100% of the people who end up transferred to ICE detention are asylum seekers. They're seeking protection. Now, how many of them will be able to obtain protection is a more difficult question. One of the questions is about how many people get past the initial stage of the screening interview. That again has been kind of a shifting number. It used to be that about 80% of people would pass that credible fear interview, but the Trump administration put in place things that made it much more difficult for them to do it. They put Border Patrol agents in control of that for a period of time, which the Border Patrol is really terrible in terms of like believing people's stories, and so the numbers dropped. I don't know where they're at more recently. I haven't seen the more recent figures, but if we look back historically, it's been about 80%. Now, when people get to the final asylum stage, the numbers have dropped. But I think my challenge in terms of the numbers that people ultimately get granted asylum, but my challenge with those numbers is that I don't feel like people are being given a fair chance, because the vast majority of those people are going through the process without representation. So, I will tell you that in my experience, a large majority of people who claim asylum have legitimate claims, right? They may not be super straightforward for the reasons that we talked about earlier, but they certainly have a case that they should be able to present to the immigration court. I would say that if they have legal representation, I see success rates of over 50%, right, of the people who have legal representation in those claims. But unfortunately, because so many of them have to go without a lawyer, the ultimate, statistics end up being lower than that, certainly below 50%.
when they do acquire this, can you dispel them? There's I think a myth out there, maybe there is some truth to this, that when people are released that they are outfitted with an ankle bracelet, or what is their means of assurance that they will re-report?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways that happens. So yes, when people, some asylum seekers are released, including at the border, or perhaps even, once they're transferred to a nice detention center, they get released. And some of them have been fitted with ankle bracelets, which we don't support. They're trying different systems. The Biden administration now is doing some like apps on the phone. They do like, phone systems to keep track of folks. But I will say that there's this kind of myth about the fact that people don't show up to court, and the statistics do not support that. So if you just look at the population broadly, I think the number in terms of asylum seekers is something like 80% or more show up to court. And if you look at people who have representation, meaning that they have lawyers in their case, the statistics are between 96 and 99% of people show up to court. So if we wanted to ensure that people show up to court, I think the best investment that we could do is to provide representation for them. And it's just simply because people get confused. People are afraid of what's going to happen in immigration court. If you're going to show up to court on your own, it's just very daunting. So that's the reason that that people sometimes don't. But even so, like I said, the vast majority of people do end up showing up to immigration court.
You're speaking to a ministerial crowd, so we're gonna shift that because I want to make sure we have the last of what we can do to help and what can be done. So one question is, are donations needed to hire lawyers who can't afford is a question. And then do you know of any organizations in Florida that are good allies for those that are doing prison ministry in Florida that they can connect to? And there's this whole idea, if you could speak to a little bit, also add that on, as far as even within your facility, the difference between ministry and advocacy. And then let's get back into that advocacy piece, because you've given us some real good pieces to work on.
Sure. Well, in terms of the donations for lawyers, I will say, of course, I wouldn't be doing my job without saying, like, yes, absolutely. Organizations like ours, we do get in some cases, we do get some support from, say, like state and local governments, in our case here in Washington State, but that's not true in other locations. And so I absolutely would urge people to help support and uplift the work of organizations like ours that are doing this work, because there's absolutely huge gap in terms of being able to do legal representation. The thing that we won't do is that sometimes people will come to us and say, like, hey, like, I want to donate so you provide lawyer for this particular individual. And as a nonprofit, we can't really do that. So, if you wanted to provide, money for a particular individual, then it would be working with a private attorney to hire them to help that person. Nonprofits have to be able to use the resources for people broadly. We do have colleagues in Florida. I can think of Americans for Immigrant Justice is one organization that we work with closely that's based in Florida. And there's actually, Catholic Charities, I will say, has different programs. I know there's a program in Miami that works with people in detention, I believe in the Chrome Detention Center in South Florida. So absolutely, I put on this PowerPoint, if you all get to share it, there's something called and actually, let me just go to this next screen here, because I have a link to the Immigration Advocates legal directory, that depending on where you are, you can actually go to the state or go to the detention center that you're working at, and you can look at the legal services providers for each of those areas. So that's an important resource for any of you that are working there, that you can look for and help connect with people with. And then Karen, I missed the last question about. So repeat that for me.
Within your system, as far as the ministerial piece to it, you're working with traumatized people, so I very, very much appreciate that you lifted that up, and that's something that we're trying to do with formation, and we need to specifically, you are addressing the trauma that these people have gone through and continue to go through. And so the ministerial piece versus the advocacy piece, because you've given us some real outline things that we need to advocate for change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I know it's a complicated issue, because I know sometimes, and can be sometimes true for even providers, is that, oftentimes like you gain access to a place like the detention center because you're providing a certain service, whether it's legal services or whether you're providing, ministry services, right? And the challenge is that, sometimes like ICE will like then try to block access if you're using that to advocate, intensely. And so I want to acknowledge that there could be some situations where there could be some restrictions, but, this system is operating, on our behalf as citizens, right, as a country, right? So I believe that we have a responsibility to educate the rest of the country as to what we're doing and what's happening in these places, right? And so, again, sharing information, because a lot of people don't know. People are surprised sometimes. Even like I go to Tacoma and they're surprised that there's a detention center that sometimes held as many as 1,500 community members right there, just down the street from downtown Tacoma. And so oftentimes this system operates kind of without people knowing about it. And so that's an important way to be able to create change. But I think also on the individual level, as I mentioned, I think being there for community members who are going through the system, lots of people don't have enough contact. And obviously the spiritual support that you can provide is really important to people because they just are so isolated in these situations that makes it very difficult.
Thank you. As the perfect note for us to end on, as far as we're so grateful for all the people that are on this call that are on a daily basis walking with people in detention. And then also those that take the opportunity to go down and just give a week and be at a respite center and just be a loving presence and a face of Christ to them and just meeting their basic needs. So Jorge, on a daily basis, God bless you. We're going to pray for your strength and your continued good work. This is amazing. And if there are any, I know there were so many questions and comments, but we'll forward them to you and get the answers back to anybody on here if we haven't met your need. But we also, please do add in there any other comments. And I hear loudly your call for addressing the trauma, being the presence, and your organization treats each individual for the dignity of whom they are, no matter where they're from. And God bless your work and thank you for it. And for those that are on this call, thank you again. Perfect.
Thank you.